everyone, it's Mrs. Shannon here, and what we're going to do today is go through the process of photosynthesis. Now, this slide deck is long. I usually don't like to make long videos because it's really hard to pay attention. So what I want you to consider doing is following along and paying attention to the slide numbers at the bottom. Take a break every once in a while. I'll give suggested breaks before we go on to the next section. So that way you can get up, move around, get your blood flowing, and come back when you are ready to pay attention, okay? So we're going to start here with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is what we call an autotrophic process. Remember, autotrophs, auto means self. So these are self-feeders. These are self-nutrient makers, okay? Plants and plant-like organisms, and so when we're saying plant-like organisms, we're thinking of things like phytoplankton, that's out in the ocean. They make their own energy in the form of glucose. Now, this energy is not usable yet, okay? But they're going to have it stored in a chemical form called glucose, and this comes from the sun's energy. It's stored as a carbohydrate in their body. We're going to talk about 4 different categories of what we call bio or macromolecules. Bio means life, molecules for life. Macro means big molecules. These consist of lipids, which are fats, nucleic acids such as DNA, amino acids, protein, which make up proteins, and proteins are my favorite, and carbohydrates, okay? The general equation here, and this is why I had us do the chemistry tutorial first so it wasn't so overwhelming, is 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, some sunlight equal glucose and oxygen. And here's a nice visual. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm also going to be playing parts of a video. The video is from HHMI, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and it goes over photosynthesis. And so I kind of like to break up me talking and showing you slides with more of an animated approach. So when we see this, that means that I will skip over to our video here, okay? And let's see if this works here. So we're going to start here with the first one.
Almost all life on Earth is solar powered. Plants, algae, and some bacteria capture light energy from the sun and convert it to chemical energy in a series of reactions called photosynthesis.
Okay, so we're taking 2 different types of energy. The energy is flowing from a solar form, okay, from the sun's energy into a chemical form. I don't know if you remember if you talked about energy last year, but there's different types of energy. There's mechanical energy, electrical energy, thermal energy. And so we can transfer energy from one form to another. And in this case, we're going from solar to chemical.
These organisms produce carbohydrates from simple building blocks like water and carbon dioxide from the environment. And in the process, they release oxygen. Photosynthesis nourishes almost the entire living world.
Okay, so we're going to stop here. What I do want you to see is rather than writing out the symbols of the elements, in this picture right here, you actually have a different model of the elements. Water is H2O. Instead of writing it out, they have 2 H's, which they're symbolizing with these white circles, and 1 O, which is this red circle. Okay, so it's just a different way to model. We're putting water in, energy in, carbon dioxide in, and in the process, we're making carbohydrates, which stay there, and oxygen, which leaves. Okay, so we're going to go back to our presentation now. And I am going to keep jumping into the present section because I can do closed captions in this format, okay? So I'm going to turn those back on just in case anyone would like to follow along. So what's the big deal here? Okay, why is photosynthesis so important? Well, the reason is because it makes these organic molecules out of something that's not organic, that's inorganic. So it's making a molecule of life. Organic molecules have to do with living organisms, okay? Molecules and living things out of something that wasn't living. It's taking these 2 molecules, carbon dioxide and water, 2 non-living molecules, and it's making these molecules that can make up life. And it all begins with food chains and webs, which is why we're doing it now. Okay, we learned about how food chains and webs can model that flow of energy and matter. Thus, all life is supported by the process. It's all connected through a web. In the process, it also makes oxygen gas. Now, many organisms need oxygen. We need oxygen. Not all organisms do, though. Okay. I noticed that on your earthworm, CER, a lot of people said that they needed oxygen. They needed to breathe. And that's not necessarily true. When we talk in our next slide set about cellular respiration, we'll talk about the reasons that oxygen is needed by many organisms, but also how other organisms that don't use oxygen have adapted and developed different ways to gain energy. So here's an example of the food web that we looked at. Okay, sun is the source of energy for most living things, 99.9%. Now, there are some organisms that do something called chemosynthesis. They use other chemicals to produce their food, like sulfur, deep organisms, bacteria, and deep sea vents, for instance. But we're going to focus on photosynthesis, since most organisms, or this starts the food chain for most food webs. We have our autotrophs, or our producers, such as plants, trees, shrubs, to make their own food. This food now has stored energy in the form of carbohydrates. Zebras, or us, or a cow, eats it. It passes on that energy and the nutrients, and then it can be transferred further on. Photosynthesis. Photo means light. Synthesize means to put together. If you synthesize music, for instance, you're putting together a song, perhaps, or a melody. Okay. If you're synthesizing ideas, you're writing a paper, maybe. Okay. So in here, we're putting together with light. Plants use sunlight to turn water and carbon dioxide into glucose. It's like the energy that's needed to jumpstart it. And glucose is a kind of sugar. You will hear glucose a lot. We're going to become very familiar with it. Glucose is a sugar. Sugar is a carbohydrate, which means glucose is a carbohydrate. It is the most fundamental, simple sugar when we're talking about photosynthesis. There's other sugars that are even more simple than this, like ribose, for instance, but it's not as important when it comes to energy as glucose is. So plants use glucose as food for energy, but they also use it as a building block for growing. So think about the video that we watched earlier, from the time lapse of the tree growing from a seed to the large adult tree. Okay, so the glucose is used as the building blocks for that growth, for that matter. So autotrophs make the glucose, self-feeding, self-nutrient providing. Heterotrophs are consumers of it. And so how do we know that plants make carbohydrates from just the carbon dioxide and water and light energy from these inorganic things? Well, experiments. And so in the explore section, or the engage section, you looked at the Van Helmont experiment, where he planted a willow branch into soil and then measured the mass after a certain amount of time, and was able to see that although the soil mass remained the same, meaning it wasn't disappearing, the tree grew significantly. So that mass had to come from somewhere else. It didn't come from the soil. And we know that matter cannot be created or destroyed. So that's where the process of photosynthesis comes in. Photosynthesis takes these two molecules here, compounds, uses a little bit of energy to get it started, and helps it rearrange to form glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen. Now, these numbers that are in green, these are called coefficients. It just tells how many molecules of each. You need 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water energy to make this. Okay? This happens, the sunlight is retrieved or gathered by the plants through a chemical, through a pigment. If you think like coloring agents, through a pigment called chlorophyll, which we'll talk more about. So as you can see from the equation, oops, let me see if I can get this little box to go away so I can actually show you what's here. The wood, bark, and root, all this mass came from these items. All that root, bark, everything else, this is glucose and some other nutrients from the soil, but a lot of glucose. So we're going to get ready for part 2. Before we go on, this would be a good time to take a break. If you want to take a break, we are on slide 8. You can come back, fast forward this to slide 8, HHMI part 2. Look at your slides on part 8 and go on. Okay, so we're going to go on here, and I am going to go back to that video, and we're going to go on to the second part. This is going to be a chemical overview of photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis is a set of chemical reactions in which light energy is converted to chemical energy. Light energy enables the movement of electrons from molecules that donate electrons to molecules that accept electrons. But which molecules? Water is the first electron donor. The carbon in carbon dioxide is the ultimate electron acceptor. Carbon dioxide combines with other molecules to form carbohydrates, such as a 3-carbon sugar called G3P. Carbohydrates are used to make other organic molecules that plants use to grow and as a source of energy to fuel their lives. An important byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen.
Okay, I don't want it all to disappear here. Really quickly, they said a word, and I don't think I put it down anywhere, but it's something that you will come across. A byproduct is a product that's made, but that's not the intent. So oxygen happens to be left over, happens to be made, but that's not the intent of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process that's driven to build these carbohydrates. There's just a second thing that's made in the process, and the tree doesn't want it, the plants don't want it, so it gets rid of it, which is good for us because we need it. Now, they're talking about electrons. If you remember in the chem tutorial, you have an atom, and in the circle, this is my little model here with my hands, in the middle, you have your nucleus that has your proton and neutrons. And remember, your electrons orbit around. Now, your electrons, there's different numbers depending on where it's at on the periodic table. What its atomic number is. And you could have anywhere from 1 up to 8 going around. Some molecules are easier for the electrons to be taken from. Okay, the electrons are easier to leave it from those orbitals, and we call those donors. And then we have other molecules that keep wanting to take more electrons. They are really, really wanting more. They have lots of room to take them, and we call those acceptors. Okay. And that's one way that molecules can interact. And when those interactions happen, that's when a reaction occurs. Oops, I'm going to pause this. We're going to go back. Okay. So here's a nice graphic. You're going to see that in this section on photosynthesis and cellular respiration, we use a lot of visuals, a lot of visual models to show the inputs, what's going in. We call those the reactants, as well as the products, okay, what is coming out, the outputs. And you should have seen reactants and products in the Explore exercise you did. When you take chemistry next year, they'll talk a lot about reactants and products, left side and right side. Inputs and outputs. So, what's this process that uses the sun energy? It's photosynthesis. The water enters through the roots and is carried upwards. The carbon dioxide enters through little openings in the leaves, which we'll find out about. The light energy is captured by pigments also on the leaf. And then the oxygen leaves by the leaf. So as you can see, the leaves play a very important role in photosynthesis. So let's start exploring that part of it.
We're going to zoom in on a cross-section of a leaf to have a closer look at the center of action for photosynthesis. A leaf has many different types of cells, such as mesophyll cells, epidermal cells, and vascular bundles.
Now, we're not going to focus too much in on the structure of the leaf. If you go on to AP biology or you take an environmental science class, you might focus more in on this, okay? But just to know that there's different types of cells. Remember, all living things are organized. We have organization going here, specialized cells that do specialized things. What I am going to want you to focus on is when they talk about these little spots right here.
Most cells in the middle of a leaf contain large numbers of chloroplasts. Pigments in chloroplasts make these cells green. Chloroplasts are the organelles where photosynthesis occurs. Carbon dioxide from the air enters a leaf through small pores called stomata on the outer cell layer. Oxygen formed during photosynthesis also exits the plant through the stomata. The plant transports organic molecules produced in its leaf cells to other cells via the plumbing system, found in vascular bundles.
I'm sorry, I find it humorous that they call it plumbing system. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what I want you to notice is these openings. The one term I want you to take from here is that there are little microscopic openings that allow gases to go in and out. This is the stomata. We used to joke around, if I were there in person, we used to play this activity where light and carbon dioxide and water came in, and we said, what's stomata with you, and produced sugar in the process. But stomatas are these openings, okay? So keep that in mind for when you are going on. Now, going back to here, this next set of slides is going to kind of go into a little bit more detail, I think, than we really need, but I didn't want to get rid of the slides. I like the slideshow overall. So I'm going to kind of modify as we go through here. So remember, the big idea here is they have many types of cells. I don't want you to memorize all these. That's just crazy, okay? Maybe in college or AP, you might talk a little bit about some of these. But the idea is that they have different cells to do different jobs, just like many other living organisms. Now, they talked about a plumbing system, and I love how they said that. And that's these cells, these tissues of similar cells that do special jobs when it comes to transporting. And we have the xylem and the phloem. These two different types of cells carry different things throughout the leaf. Okay, together, they are found within the vein. Okay, so the vein is sort of what holds it together, what goes around, and it's like the tubes itself, and then you had xylem and phloem in it. Xylem is responsible for transporting water. Phloem is responsible for transporting the nutrients and the carbohydrates that are made. Okay. So here's just an example of a picture. And the cool thing is with plant cells, they are green when you look at them. You can see if you look at them underneath a microscope, you can see all these little green spots in them. And that's because those green spots within the cell are the chloroplasts. They're little organelles. They're organelles with a special job, and it has to do with photosynthesis. Now it's green because what pigment is found in a chloroplast? Chlorophyll. They go together. Just remember, chloroplast, chlorophyll. So here's an actual image of an Alodia leaf. You can see these individual cells. Now, plant cells have walls to kind of offer support, and it also helps when we talk about water transport and homeostasis. We're going to talk about why cells have cell walls. But you can see each kind of rectangle is a cell, and you can see the little chloroplasts that are found all within this little rectangle. The chloroplast is like the factory that makes these sugars. Okay, it's where everything happens. There's other organelles doing other things within that cell, but it's the chloroplast that the photosynthesis is occurring at. So we're going to learn more about the chloroplast now. Now, before we go on, here is another stopping point. If you would like to pause the video now, we are on slide 15. Take a break and come back. And you can pick up to watch the chloroplast. Okay, going on with the chloroplast.
Let's take a closer look at a chloroplast, the organelle where photosynthesis takes place. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of chemical reactions, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. They occur in different regions of the chloroplasts. Chloroplasts contain stacks of membrane-lined discs called thylakoids, surrounded by a watery clear fluid called stroma. The light reactions are carried out by molecules in the thylakoid membranes, and the Calvin cycle reactions by molecules in the stroma. Let's explore these regions and their functions in more detail. In the thylakoid membranes, the light reactions transform light energy to chemical energy. Light energy drives the formation of ATP molecules from ADP and of NADPH molecules from NADP+ and electrons. Along the way, water molecules are split and oxygen is formed, which can be released into the atmosphere. In the stroma, the Calvin cycle reactions use the chemical energy of ATP and NADPH to combine carbon dioxide from the air with organic molecules to form new molecules like the sugar G3P. ADP and NADP+ are recycled and may be used again in the light reactions.
Okay, now who is thoroughly confused and feels like you're listening to a foreign language? Okay, there are a lot of molecules that they started throwing out. There's a lot of different processes going on. They're showing us an elemental form. They're showing us ADP, and that doesn't even look like a molecular compound that we've heard about. But don't worry, we're going to break it down coming up. Now, the big part to take away from the chloroplast is that there are just parts within it. Remember, everything's organized, okay? We're made of cells. Cells are made of organelles. Organelles, like the chloroplast, are made of smaller parts, each with a different job. And so when light comes in, okay, it's captured by these little thylakoids, these little pancakes that are green because of the chlorophyll. It makes all this energy. This energy is then able to leave into this like little gooey stuff surrounding the thylakoids. And this energy is used to build up your sugars, your organic molecules. So the idea with the chloroplast is know that there are two parts, thylakoids and stroma, and know that the light is captured on the green thylakoids, okay? Let's go back here. Okay, we're going to also take a walk because I have to let a dog in while we're doing this. Okay, so leaves are green, and we talked about this already because they contain the pigment chlorophyll. Usually leaves have a pretty large surface area because it's trying to absorb as much light as possible. The thing is that chloroplasts, in capturing this light and taking in the CO2, they also make oxygen gas. And we can see that. We can measure that. And there are experiments that do just that. Okay. We talked about the stomata. Okay. The stomata is the plural form of stoma. Okay. One stoma, multiple stomata. It's the opening. So the gases, can you name the gases that go in and out of the leaves? Carbon dioxide and oxygen. So if you got that, nice job. Okay, now there are different pigments besides chlorophyll. They all absorb different colors of white light. So this light from the sun coming in, okay, there's multiple spectrum. It's a huge spectrum, the Roy G. Biv spectrum here of white light. And each pigment absorbs different colors and reflects the other ones. Now, the main pigment that we're interested in is chlorophyll A, but there's also other pigments, chlorophyll B and carotenoids. So the reason that it is green is because it absorbs all of the wavelengths except for that green color. That green color is reflected back. And that's what, when it's reflected off, is what we see. The reason carrots are orange, for instance, okay, is because all of the colors are reflected off except for the orange pigment. Okay. The green is reflected and not absorbed. So that's just a little interesting side note. You don't have to memorize or know this whole like light spectrum. Just recognize that chlorophyll is a pigment and why it's green. Now, different colors of light have different wavelengths. The wavelength determines its color. And so here is the wavelength of red. It's a little bit further apart. These photons, these particles are further apart. Now, there's actually nothing that makes it up. It's not made of matter. It gets really confusing. Physics is just crazy here. But just for now, please accept it, and you can explore it more in physics or physical science, that different colors have different wavelengths, bigger and smaller, and that determines the color. Okay, So this is just another way to show it that they're different. I am skipping this slide. So those of you going through it, skip this slide completely. This goes into a lot more detail than we need to know. Okay, so remember the interaction of light with the stuff in the chloroplast is divided into 3 parts. We have the absorbed light, all of the wavelengths besides green. The green is reflected, and some of it's actually able to go through. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. It's talking about the leaf and the chloroplast in more detail. I am going to go back and skip the slides in it because we're going to come up to it in a minute, and it's just too overwhelming. So here's the deal. In plants and simple animals, waste products are removed by a process called diffusion. And you will talk about diffusion when you look at the way things are transported. Diffusion is moving from an area of high concentration, where there's a lot of it, to an area of low concentration. So plants, for example, excrete O2. It's making these byproducts, the O2 and the chloroplast, and it builds up and it builds up. And so eventually it's going to diffuse out. Okay, it starts to spread out. Again, the equation, this is something that you will want to memorize. Okay, now remember that confusing part of the video earlier with photosynthesis, and they started talking about 2 different processes and it got really chaotic? Well, in a minute, we're going to take another break because I'm going to need you guys to put your brain hats on. So if you need to do some stretches, run around the house, scream, hit a wall, do so, because we're going to start talking about light-dependent and light-independent reactions, okay? The first part is the light-dependent reaction, and what it does is it converts the light energy into ATP, and we'll talk about ATP. That ATP then goes on and is used as a fuel in the light-independent reaction to make sugars. So get ready for that. And when you are ready, come back and we're going to start by looking at the light-dependent reaction. Okay.
A plant increases its biomass through the formation.
There we go.
The thylakoid membranes contain specialized molecules.
Okay, so remember those pancakes that were like laying on top of one another almost? Okay, those are the thylakoids. So those circular flat pancakes, this is like the edge that goes around it. This is the surface of those pancakes. So here's the inside, and here's the outside.
That work together to perform the light reactions. Light is absorbed by protein pigment complexes called photosystems. There are 2 photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. The photosystems transform light energy to chemical energy by exciting and then shuttling electrons from molecule to molecule in a chain-like fashion on the thylakoid membrane. This process is called an electron transport chain. Let's take a closer look to see how this process works. First, photons of light hit chlorophyll, a light-absorbing pigment in photosystem 2. Electrons in the chlorophyll are excited to a higher energy level. The excited electrons are passed to an electron carrier. Meanwhile, water splits and releases electrons. These electrons replace those lost at photosystem 2. The byproduct of this reaction is oxygen, which is eventually released into the air. The other products are protons, or hydrogen ions, which are released into the inside of the thylakoid, or lumen. The excited electrons move to the cytochrome complex. Some of the energy from the electrons is used by the cytochrome complex to transport additional protons into the lumen. The second electron carrier, a protein inside the lumen, receives the electrons and passes them to photosystem 1. These electrons have now lost most of the energy they gained from light in photosystem 2. Photons of light hit chlorophyll in photosystem 1 and excite the electrons again. The electrons are then passed to the third electron carrier. Finally, these electrons are either recycled or they interact with an enzyme and NADP+, the final electron acceptor of the light reactions, to form NADPH. Some of the energy from light is now stored in the reduced molecule NADPH. Some of the energy released from the transfer of electrons established a proton gradient across the thylakoid membrane.
Now, a gradient means that there's a
Protons that
difference in the
accumulated
number.
in the lumen diffuse into the stroma through an enzyme called...
Okay, so notice there's more dots on the inside here than there is on the outside. There's more hydrogen, protons, which it's a proton ion. It means it lost its electron, so it's just a single proton now. But there's more in here than outside. And so when that happens, it diffuses and moves from an area from greater to least. It moves to this side over here.
called ATP synthase. ATP synthase uses the potential energy of the proton gradient to combine ADP with inorganic phosphate to form ATP. In this way, the potential energy is
Okay, we're going to stop there. You do not need to know this word. We'll talk about this later on. The idea here, I want to show you the big ideas. Okay, you do not need to memorize every single step, but what you do need to know is that the photons come in. Photon is the light particle. The light comes in to these photosystems where the chlorophyll is, okay? And that energy is used to split water molecules. Remember the water that's taken up through the roots, okay? And now the hydrogen from the water molecules, they start to accumulate inside the thylakoid. And the oxygen is released to the environment because we don't need it. The plant doesn't need it, okay? But these hydrogens remain in here for now. At the same time, there's an electron from that molecule that's released. And the electron moves on down, moving on down to the next photosystem because we get so excited from the photons. And eventually, it keeps moving from one complex. These complexes, by the way, are called proteins. We'll talk more about proteins. Proteins are the bomb. They do everything in the body. They're like the little minions. But they jump from protein to protein until they get up here. Here, they hop in a NADP+, okay? You don't need to know what the NAD and P stand for, but you need to know that if you see this little plus here, think of it as an empty taxi cab. It is ready to grab onto one of these electrons that has moved its on the way up here. It's moved on up, okay? It's been traveling just to get to this taxi cab. Now it hops a ride, okay? We call that electron, it's the electron from that hydrogen earlier. So it's NADPH, okay? It's NADPH now. This means that it's a full cab. It's got its electron and it's ready to move on. It can provide energy. This is the unfilled version, cannot provide energy. This is once it gets its electron. It can provide energy, so it can move on to the next stage. Now, this is not the only source of energy. Even bigger of a taxi cab is this one right here. ADP, once it gets its hydrogen, once it's pumped through, can form ATP. It helps this bond together. And so we're going to from a adenine diphosphate to a triphosphate. We'll learn more about ATP later on too. But the idea is this is your money. This is your energy money. Okay, this is your currency to do things in your body. To get in anywhere, to get anything done, you need ATP. The more ATP, the better. And we'll talk about that in cellular respiration. This is the money maker. ATP is our money maker. Okay? But to form that, we need our protons to get in the taxi cab. We need to form it. Okay? We need to get it going. So these are two energy transports that are just full of energy. ATP even more so than this one, but they're both able to take the electrons, to take this energy to the next stage. So idea here again, review, we'll talk about it in the next slides, is that the photons come in, splits the water, hydrogen's going to end up going way down here and diffusing through to hitch a ride with ATP, energy molecule to go on, while the electron moves on down through the complexes until it joins its ride up here and becomes NADPH, which is going to move on. So now let's look at it in some other models here. Okay, captions on, and we are going. So obviously, chlorophyll's there. It's absorbing the light, so we call it the light-dependent reaction because it depends on light. It occurs in the thylakoids, like on the membrane. That chlorophyll traps the energy, and it excites the electrons, so it makes them move it on down. It kicks them out, okay? And we call that little movement of electrons, it's an electron transport chain. That's going to come up in cellular respiration too. They call it a bucket brigade because you're just moving on down. Like, back in the old days to put out fires, you would do a bucket brigade, and you'd have like a line of people, and they would take buckets, and they'd pass water from one bucket to the next bucket to the next bucket. And that's the idea of what's going on here. Now, the thing with the light reaction is that some energy is lost, but that's okay because it's made, that energy is lost to what we call ATP. The ATP is good. This is what like the body wants. Unfortunately, it's not enough ATP to really power our body, but it's enough ATP for the next step to form those glucose, which is going to be like really good energy molecules. NADPH, it also is storing energy to go out into the stroma. Okay, so those are good. So the whole purpose of the light reaction, the whole reason it happens is to produce these two molecules to move on to the next reaction to really make your money makers. Okay, now oxygen again is a byproduct. Yay for us. Plants don't really care. It gets rid of it. There is a process, photolysis. We're not even worrying about that, but lyse, if something lyses, L-Y-S-E, that means it's kind of like releases, it bursts, it explodes. And so the light makes the water split, kind of release the oxygen. You don't need to know photolysis though. Here's just another way to look at it about how the energy is passed down steps. I think it's a little bit more confusing for this one right here. So you might want to skip slide 35. So that's the light reaction. Okay, brain's probably fried. Go take a run around your house. Maybe you can turn on a light, lay there, tell your parents that you're a plant, absorbing the photons so you can release your electrons. Just joking, you really can't do photosynthesis. You don't have chlorophyll or chloroplast, but your mom might be impressed. Okay, next up, light independent reaction, also known as the Calvin cycle. Because, we always want to name things. If you're a scientist and you work on something, sometimes you get things named after you. So we're going to explore the Calvin cycle, aka the light independent reaction. I'm not going to play the full part, but we'll look at part of it. It's going to be a little...
The Calvin cycle takes place in the chloroplasts.
So really quickly, remember, thylakoid, capture the light, split the water, oxygen's released, but we have this little energy molecules, these little caps of molecules that can transport into the stroma and power, I should say, not complete, but power the light independent reaction or the Calvin cycle.
Stroma, the watery clear fluid surrounding the thylakoids. It's helpful to think of the Calvin cycle in 3 phases: fixation, reduction, and regeneration.
It's kind of like nitrogen, like when we look at the carbon cycle, nitrogen fixation.
Inorganic carbon, in the form of carbon dioxide from the air, is incorporated into organic molecules, a process known as carbon fixation. 3 molecules of carbon dioxide react with 3 molecules of ribulose bisphosphate.
You don't need to know that molecule.
To produce 6 molecules of a 3-carbon molecule called 3-PGA. The enzyme Rubisco catalyzes this reaction. In the second phase, the organic molecules accept electrons, a process known as reduction. The 6 molecules of 3-PGA use 6 molecules of ATP and 6 molecules of NADPH, which store energy from the light reactions, to generate 6 molecules of G3P. The G3P molecules contain more electrons and are higher in potential energy than 3PGA. One molecule of G3P exits the cycle. It can be used to make other organic molecules. In phase 3, the regeneration phase, a large set of reactions use the other 5 molecules of G3P and energy from 3 molecules of ATP to produce 3 molecules of RUBP. With RUBP reformed, the process can start again.
Okay, again, whoa, mind blown. There's a lot going on here. This is the part that I want you guys to get out of this. Okay, remember, carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, that's one of the reactants. That's one of the inputs, but it was not needed for the light, the first part, okay? This is where it comes into play. This is where that carbon dioxide comes into play, okay? So this Calvin cycle. So it's taken in the first part here, and it's just rearranged so that it's usable, okay? Fixation means to put into a form that it can be used. From there, remember those ATP and the NAD pH molecules that we had from our first part? Okay, this is where they come into play. They are powering, they are providing the energy for phase 2. In phase 2, we make this G3P. Now, this is what's important, okay, because it's ejected here. These G3Ps, okay, these are going to come together to make our sugars. These are the important ones. These are the bases of our carbohydrates that are going to store lots and lots of energy. Okay, so this is what's important. And then phase 3, they just try to break down some parts again because you're going to have to use them again to fix the new carbon dioxide coming in and repeat it. And they call it a Calvin cycle because obviously it can go around and around as long as carbon dioxide is coming in, as long as we have enough ATP and ADP from the first part, the light reaction, then we're good to go. Okay, but this G3P that's exiting out, this is the part that's going to come and start combining to form glucose, to form sucrose, to form cellulose, and all the other organic molecules of importance here. So let's look at it in our slides. The light independent reaction, it's independent of, which means it doesn't need it. Okay, we've already used light for what we needed it for, and that was to split water. We call that the Calvin cycle. It requires CO2. It uses ATP and NADPH. Remember, that was generated from the first part as fuel, okay? I call it as an ignition, like as a starter. And it makes glucose sugar. And so what ends up happening is these G3Ps, you take 2 of those G3Ps and voila, you have glucose. Okay, so here's a picture of that Calvin cycle again. This takes away all the scary, probably diagrams, and you can see the important parts here. CO2 coming in, the energy powering the formation of the G3P, and it can leave. 2 G3Ps are going to make glucose, and then it gets ready to do the cycle again. So now here's the deal. Photosynthesis has 2 parts, the light dependent and the light independent. And in both parts, if something changes, it can affect photosynthesis and how fast or how slow it happens, okay? And we refer to that as the rate of photosynthesis. One of the things that can affect photosynthesis is light intensity, or how strong a light is. As light increases, okay, as there's more light there, more photons available, it can power more water to split, okay? Changing the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment. More carbon dioxide available for that light independent reaction for the Calvin cycle means that cycle can happen more often. That means you're going to produce more glucose. The rate of photosynthesis increases. And so there's different variables that could affect how fast photosynthesis occurs, or even if it occurs at all. Temperature. If you have a low temperature, experiments have shown that photosynthesis is low. If temperature increases, rate increases. However, if it's too hot, it drops. Okay, and a lot of that has to do with like evaporation and the water and the stomata opening and closing. And so when you're in AP, actually, you look at leaf disc labs and you try out some of these variables. So really quick question. I want you to check it. Okay. The process that uses, oops, I forgot I'm not in captions. Let's check yourself now and see what you were able to take from this. The process that uses the sun's energy to make simple sugars is blank. What do you think it is? I don't remember if I highlighted it or if I have to just tell you. Nope, I just have to tell you. Hopefully you put C, photosynthesis. Okay. The function accomplished by the light-dependent reaction, the part that needs the light, that relies on it, is what? Is it energy storage, sugar production, carbon fixation, or conversion of sugar? Okay, correct answer is A, energy storage. Now, I said it was to make energy to go on to the next part, okay? It's being stored in that like little taxi cab of ATP and NADPH. Sugar production and carbon fixation. Carbon fixation is the first part, and then sugar production in the Calvin cycle is the second part. The conversion of sugar right here, this is referring to the third part of the Calvin cycle where it breaks it down. So here is a picture here, a nice little picture that highlights everything together. And I would like you to copy this down into your book. It hits everything that you need to know and a good amount of detail, okay? And so you have you have your thylakoids here, okay? The energy from the sun, you have water. We have our light-dependent reaction. The energy from the sun splits the water and oxygen leaves. Meanwhile, it generates enough energy in ATP and NADPH that can then be used to power the Calvin cycle, the light-independent reaction, which occurs in the stroma. This forms glucose. I didn't say this, but that ATP and NADPH, once the electrons are used to power it, it can now go back and capture more electrons from the light-dependent reaction. It does talk about the rubisco. Rubisco is an enzyme. Basically, a rubisco is just a molecule that helps the whole thing happen. I will not ask you any questions on an exam about rubisco, but this way you're not blindsided if you come across that term in some other reading or in another game. And so once you get this down, this is photosynthesis in a nutshell. If you have questions, email. Hopefully when you go on to the elaborate sections, it will make a little bit more sense. Cheers, everybody.